Hello, house fans. It's ThatPodcastGirl Cdub, and this is a podcast about house music. For years, this story got told a certain way. House came first in Chicago, and then a little later, techno showed up in Detroit, almost like a colder cousin arriving late to the party, borrowing a sound that already belonged to somebody else. I want to tell you right now, that version is wrong. Because at the same exact time Frankie Knuckles was reshaping disco on Chicago's west side, something else was happening less than a day's drive away, in a bedroom outside Detroit, on the same kind of drum machines, powered by the same kind of hunger to make something nobody had heard yet. This is case file number 2, The Missing Twin. Case note 1, the family tree was filed wrong. Here's the lazy version of this story, the one you'll hear if you only read one paragraph about it. House came first in Chicago, techno came later in Detroit, so techno must be House's little cousin, House with the emotion drained out and the chrome painted on. That's a tidy story. It's also not what the record shows. Juan Atkins, one of 3 friends from Belleville who'd gone on to shape this whole sound, released Alleys of Your Mind under the name Cybotron in 1981 on his own tiny label, out of a relationship formed at community college with a Vietnam veteran named Rick Davis, a synth expert with serious gear who taught Atkins the basics of electronic production. The record sold well locally around Detroit before most of Chicago's foundational house records had even been pressed. So this was never really a straight line, Chicago first, Detroit downstream. This was 2 things happening at close to the same time in the same Midwestern corridor. Chicago on one end, a small town called Belleville outside Detroit on the other, connected less by geography than by records, machines, radio signals, and hunger. The cleaner file, the one we're opening today, says this: Chicago house and Detroit techno are fraternal twins, not identical and not parent and child. They're born close together, sharing real DNA, raised by 2 different rooms. And when the family tree gets filed wrong, everything after that gets distorted. Who gets called original, who gets called derivative, who gets centered, and who gets footnoted. Case note 2, the DNA. Before we get into what made these 2 sounds different, I want to be honest about what they actually share, because the twin metaphor only works if the DNA is real. Both cities were drawing from disco and its afterlife. Both were drawing from funk and soul, Detroit especially from Parliament and George Clinton, whose influence on the Belleville 3 runs so deep that Derek May would later describe their entire sound as, in his words, something like George Clinton and Kraftwerk trapped in an elevator with nothing but a sequencer to keep them company. Both cities were drawing from European electronic music. Kraftwerk's fingerprints are on both Chicago house and Detroit techno, just pressed down with different weight. Both cities had access to the same generation of drum machines, synthesizers, and sequencers, newly cheap enough for teenagers to get their hands on. The same handful of roll-in boxes showing up in bedrooms on both sides of this story, even if the exact gear evolved a little differently city to city. And both cities had radio as a lifeline. Chicago had WBMX and the Hot Mix 5, turning club music into citywide youth culture. Detroit had a DJ named Charles Johnson. Everyone called him the Electrifying Mojo, who ran a 5-hour show called the Midnight Funk Association on WGPR, with no format restrictions at all. One night he might be playing Kraftwerk's Trans-Europe Express back-to-back with Parliament, then Prince, then something nobody in the room had a name for yet. The same DNA and a different nursery. That's the whole case file. First nursery is in Chicago. We're not going to rebuild the warehouse for you again. You already know that room. You already know Frankie Knuckles and Ron Hardy and the Music Box. You already know Jesse Saunders and the whole contested first record argument. That's episode 1's file. What I want you to hold on to here for comparison's sake is the shape of Chicago's upbringing. House was raised inside a room, a specific address, a specific crowd packed close enough to become one organism, a specific DJ reading that crowd in real time and deciding, song by song, whether tonight's version of the record worked. Chicago's question, the one baked into the music itself, was, how do we hold this room together until sunrise? That's the nursery. Bodies, sweat, and proximity. A dance floor in Chicago that could kill a record or crown it. So if Chicago's twin was raised by the room, Detroit's twin was raised by the signal. And now we enter the second nursery in Detroit. Here's the twin nobody raised in that other room in Chicago. Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson met at Belleville High School, a small, mostly white farm town about 30 miles outside Detroit. Of a school of a few thousand kids, they were among a small handful who were black. That distance mattered, close enough to catch Detroit's signal at night. Far enough that they weren't standing inside a Chicago-style club sanctuary at all. They were 3 teenagers in a bedroom, lying with their feet in each other's faces, listening to the radio until 5 in the morning. Belleville was not the warehouse. There was no room packed wall to wall. No ceiling dripping onto dancers. No DJ standing 3 feet away watching bodies react in real time. But there was distance, quiet lawns, car culture, a city close enough to haunt the imagination, but far enough to become myth. Detroit reached them through radio first, not as a room they were standing inside, but as a signal they had to decode. Derek May would later describe those nights almost exactly like that. Himself and Juan lying in bed facing opposite directions, feet by each other's heads, listening to whatever the electrifying mojo decided to play that particular hour, and wondering what the people who made those records had been thinking about. Detroit had rooms too. Detroit had dancers too. We've spent whole episodes in those rooms. But this twin's origin story keeps returning to a different kind of nursery. The bedroom, the radio, the small town outside the city, the machine, and the signal arriving late at night, telling 3 black kids that the future was something they were allowed to imagine too. Juan Atkins took that signal and built Cybotron with Rick Davis. Alleys of Your Mind in 1981. Clear the year after. Tracks that sound less like a party and more like a city quietly talking to its own machinery. Derek May took the same machines and let them crack open emotionally. Strings of Life doesn't sound cold at all. It sounds like circuitry having a breakdown and a breakthrough in the same 4 minutes. And Kevin Saunderson, working with vocalist Paris Gray as Inner City, gave the machine a smile. Big Fun put a hook and a voice on top of Detroit's sound and sent it to the charts without losing the pulse underneath. There's a detail here worth keeping because it says something true about how casually great work sometimes arrives. By Derek May's own account, Big Fun almost didn't make the 1988 UK compilation that would end up naming this whole genre. It was the last track added, almost as an afterthought, with Kevin apparently calling it a piece of shit, before Juan went back into the studio and cleaned up the vocals. Nobody expected it to do anything, but it went on to sell millions of records. Detroit's question, the one baked into Techno, was different from Chicago's. It wasn't, how do we hold this room together? It was, can we imagine another world from here? Exhibit 5, same machine, different alibi. Here's the part of this case I find genuinely moving once you sit with it. The exact same drum machine, an 808, a 909, the same circuit board, the same factory, could become two completely different things depending on which city plugged it in. In Detroit, that drum machine became something like a prosthetic for the dancer's body, a reliable pulse built to keep a room of people locked together in the dark. In Detroit, that same drum machine became proof that the future could be programmed by black hands. The machine isn't the meaning, the city decides what the machine is for. Chicago used repetition like a hand on your back, keeping you inside the groove until your body finally gave in. Detroit used repetition like a vehicle, taking that same body somewhere else entirely. Chicago said, "Come closer," but Detroit said, "Look further." Case Note 6, the naming. For a while, this genuinely was one big, messy, overlapping conversation. Detroit producers listening to Chicago house. Chicago producers making tracks that would later get filed as techno adjacent, before either word had fully hardened into its own category. Then, in 1988, a UK dance music entrepreneur named Neil Rushton approached the Belleville 3 about licensing their records for a compilation overseas. And here's the detail that matters most for this case file. The word techno wasn't handed to them by the UK. It was already theirs. Atkins had used it earlier on a Cybotron track called Techno City, itself a nod to the futurist writer Alvin Toffler's language about techno rebels. Rushton and the Belleville 3 deliberately chose to build a compilation around that word, specifically to separate their sound from Chicago house in the marketplace. The record was called Techno, the new dance sound of Detroit. That's the moment the twin got its own birth certificate. Not the moment it was born, but the moment somebody finally filled out the paperwork correctly. And now the verdict. So, was Detroit the place house music escaped to? Did it run 300 miles east and put on a chrome disguise? No, that file was just wrong from the start. Detroit was not the kidnapper. Detroit was the missing twin, raised close enough to hear the same signal, but far away enough to answer in its own language. Chicago raised a sound that could hold a room together until sunrise, but Detroit raised a sound that could imagine another world entirely, from a bedroom in a farm town at 1 a.m. One twin learned to sweat, the other twin learned to glow. And maybe that's the real correction this episode owes you. This season keeps finding out that a genre almost never arrives with one parent and one clean birth certificate. Sometimes it doesn't even arrive as one child. It arrives as twins, separated at birth. That's case file number 2. Now both twins have names, House and Techno. Until next time, keep the beats alive.